The morning Jacob Hartley vanished, the temperature in Pineville, North Carolina, had dropped to 28 degrees, and frost covered the pine needles like glass shards across the forest floor. It was December 3rd, 2009, 3 days before his 14th birthday. His mother, Linda Hartley, had sent him to fetch firewood from the shed behind their modest ranch house on Timber Creek Road, a winding stretch of asphalt that cut through 40,000 acres of longleaf pine. When she called him for breakfast 20 minutes later, only silence answered. The back door stood open, swinging slightly in the wind. The wheelbarrow sat empty beside the woodpile. Jacob's winter coat hung on its hook by the door. By noon, sheriff's deputies had combed through 5 square miles of dense woodland. By nightfall, the story dominated local news. By the end of the week, the FBI had joined the search, bringing cadaver dogs and helicopter surveillance. Linda appeared on television, her voice breaking as she begged whoever had taken her son to bring him home. Jacob's father, who'd left the family 4 years earlier, drove up from Atlanta and stayed in a motel, coordinating with investigators. They found nothing. No footprints beyond the woodpile, no signs of struggle, no witnesses. Jacob Hartley had simply ceased to exist. If you're watching this story unfold, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Your support helps us continue investigating these mysterious cases. The official report, filed 6 months after Jacob's disappearance, concluded that he had likely succumbed to exposure in the vast pine forest. Despite extensive searches, winter storms had complicated recovery efforts. The case remained open, but resources shifted elsewhere. Linda refused to accept the conclusion. She plastered missing person posters across 3 counties. She maintained a blog documenting every lead, every possible sighting. She attended support groups for parents of missing children, though she rarely spoke, just listened to others describe their grief while clutching Jacob's school photograph. Her sister Diane moved in to help with bills, since Linda could barely function at her job as a school secretary. The house on Timber Creek Road became a shrine, Jacob's room untouched, his birthday marked each year with a cake no one ate. Detective Raymond Porter had worked the case from day one. A 20-year veteran of the Pineville Sheriff's Department, he'd investigated countless missing persons. But something about Jacob's disappearance gnawed at him. The complete absence of evidence suggested either extraordinary planning or circumstances so unusual they defied conventional investigation. Porter kept the case file in his office, reviewing it periodically, adding notes about similar disappearances across the Southeast. He'd interviewed Jacob's classmates at Pineville Middle School, teachers who remembered him as quiet and artistic, neighbors who'd seen him walking home that afternoon. Everyone painted the same picture: a lonely kid who spent hours drawing in sketchbooks, who preferred solitude to sports, who'd withdrawn further after his father left. Nothing suggested he was planning to run away. No behavioral changes, no concerning friendships, no internet searches about disappearing or surviving in wilderness. The years accumulated like sediment. Linda's hair turned grey. Diane eventually moved back to her own apartment, though she visited weekly. The missing person posters faded and peeled. Television shows about unsolved mysteries occasionally featured Jacob's case, generating brief bursts of tips that led nowhere. The FBI officially downgraded their involvement. Porter retired in 2016, but he kept copies of the case file at home, unable to let go completely. Life in Pineville continued its slow rural rhythm, tobacco fields giving way to solar farms, the old textile mill converted to apartments, young people moving to Charlotte for opportunities. Jacob Hartley became another ghost story parents told when warning children about wandering too far into the woods. Then, on August 14, 2022, a man walked into the Laramie Police Department in Wyoming and asked to speak with someone about a missing person case from North Carolina. He was thin, weathered, with a beard and long hair pulled into a ponytail. He wore work clothes, denim and flannel, and carried a backpack that looked like it had traveled considerable distance. When the desk officer asked his name, he paused for several seconds before answering. "Jacob Hartley," he said. "I need to correct some things about what happened to me." The Laramie police contacted Pineville within the hour. Porter, now 63 and supposedly enjoying retirement, received the call from his former partner at 4:47 p.m. Mountain Time. He was in his garage, organizing fishing equipment, when his phone rang. The voice on the other end said words Porter had imagined but never truly believed he'd hear. "Ray, they found Jacob Hartley. He's alive. He walked into a police station in Wyoming." Porter sat down on his workbench, the phone pressed against his ear, listening to details that made no sense. "Alive? Wyoming?" Walked in voluntarily, claiming his disappearance wasn't what the report said. Porter's hands shook as he wrote down the information. Within 2 hours, he'd booked a flight to Denver and arranged a rental car for the 3-hour drive to Laramie. Linda received the news from an FBI agent who drove to her house rather than calling. She was washing dishes when the doorbell rang, and when she saw the agent's expression, carefully neutral, professional, her first thought was that they'd found remains. Instead, the agent said, "Mrs. Hartley, we have reason to believe your son Jacob is alive and in police custody in Wyoming." Linda's knees buckled. The agent caught her arm, guiding her to the couch. The questions came in a torrent. How? Where? Why? When? But the agent had few answers. Jacob had requested that his mother not be contacted until he'd given his full statement. He wanted to explain everything first, to make sure she understood before they spoke. Linda's emotional response cycled through disbelief, joy, confusion, and anger within minutes. 13 years. Her son had been alive for 13 years while she'd mourned him as dead. The Laramie Police Department provided Jacob with a hotel room and a lawyer, though he insisted he wasn't in trouble and didn't need legal representation. He agreed to a medical examination, which revealed old fractures in his left arm and ribs, malnutrition scars, and vitamin deficiencies consistent with inadequate diet during developmental years. A DNA test confirmed his identity within 48 hours. During those 2 days, while Porter traveled west and Linda made frantic preparations to fly out, Jacob sat in interview rooms and began telling a story that contradicted every assumption investigators had made about his disappearance. He spoke slowly, choosing words carefully, as if the act of explaining required translating from some internal language back into English. The detective interviewing him, a woman named Susan Torres, with 15 years in missing persons work, recorded everything while trying not to show her reaction to what she was hearing. Jacob began with the morning he disappeared, but his version diverged sharply from the official narrative. He hadn't wandered into the pine woods and gotten lost. He hadn't been abducted by a stranger. He'd seen something by the woodpile that morning, a man standing at the tree line, maybe 40 yards away, watching the house. The man had gestured to Jacob urgently, as if signaling him to come quickly, and Jacob, for reasons he still struggled to articulate, had followed. The man had been his father, not Michael Hartley, the man who'd left the family in 2005 and who'd participated in the search efforts, but a man Jacob had never seen before, who claimed to be his biological father, who said Michael Hartley had stolen him as an infant, who had spent years searching for the son taken from him. The man's name was William Cross, and he had identification, photographs, and a story about a custody dispute that had gone catastrophically wrong. He told Jacob that Linda wasn't actually his mother, that she'd helped Michael kidnap him from his real family in Pennsylvania when he was 6 months old. He spoke with desperate intensity, showing Jacob old pictures, a baby that might have been him, a woman who resembled him around the eyes. William said he'd hired private investigators, that he'd finally found them in North Carolina, that he'd been watching for weeks, waiting for the right moment. He begged Jacob to come with him just for a few hours to meet his real mother, who'd been heartbroken for 13 years. Jacob, 14 and confused and carrying all the abandonment issues from Michael's departure, had believed him, or rather, wanted to believe him. The possibility that there was a family somewhere who'd been searching for him, who actually wanted him, proved too compelling to resist. He'd followed William to a truck parked on a logging road half a mile into the woods. They'd driven away from Pineville before anyone noticed Jacob was missing. By the time the search began, they were already crossing into Tennessee. Detective Torres listened to this account with growing unease. "Did you try to contact your mother, Linda Hartley?" Jacob's face tightened. "He said we needed to wait until we reached Pennsylvania. He said Linda and Michael had lawyers, that they'd fight to keep me, that we needed to get to his home state first where he had custody documents. I was a kid. I believed him. I wanted to believe him." Torres made notes, her pen moving steadily across the page. "And when did you realize he wasn't actually your father?" "About a week in," Jacob said quietly. "We never went to Pennsylvania. We went to Montana, to this compound in the mountains outside of Bozeman. There were other families there, like 30 people. William was part of this survivalist community. They believed the government was going to collapse, that they needed to be self-sufficient. The woman he said was my mother. She died 2 years before. William had lost his actual son in a car accident in 2007, and I guess he'd just broken. Started believing that he could replace what he'd lost. That I could become his son." The room fell silent except for the hum of the recording equipment. Torres set down her pen. "Jacob, why didn't you try to escape? Why didn't you tell someone?" His answer came slowly, painfully. "Because by the time I fully understood what had happened, we were in the middle of nowhere. The compound was 20 miles from the nearest town. No phones, they didn't allow them, no internet. They homeschooled all the kids. And William, he wasn't violent exactly, but he was controlling. He convinced me that if I tried to leave, if I contacted anyone, I'd be putting my false family in danger. He said people who exposed the compound faced consequences. I was 14, then 15, then 16. I was scared. And then, I guess I just adapted. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. Eventually it became normal, the only life I knew." Porter arrived in Laramie on August 16th, walking into the police station with the case file he'd kept for 13 years. When they brought him to Jacob, the young man, now 27 years old, barely resembled the 14-year-old from the missing person posters. But his eyes were the same, Porter noted, that same watchful artistic quality that people had described. They shook hands, and Porter said simply, "I never stopped looking." Jacob's composure cracked slightly. "I know, I'm sorry." Over the next several hours, Jacob walked Porter through the entire 13 years. The compound in Montana where he'd lived from 2009 until 2019, learning carpentry and farming, attending communal meals, participating in their isolated society. How he'd become James Cross, William's son, and how after a while it became easier to accept that identity than fight it. How he'd watched other teenagers grow up in the same environment, some born there, some brought like him. How William had treated him with genuine affection, as if he truly believed Jacob was his reincarnated son, and how that psychological manipulation had made escape feel like betrayal rather than freedom. The compound had dissolved in 2019 when federal authorities investigated them for tax evasion and weapons violations. The community scattered, families relocating to different states. William had moved them to Wyoming, to a ranch outside of Laramie, where they'd lived for the past 3 years. During that time, Jacob had begun working construction jobs in town, gradually reconnecting with the outside world. He'd gotten a driver's license under his false identity. He'd used library computers to search for news about his disappearance, reading his mother's blog posts, seeing Porter's occasional media interviews. The guilt had accumulated until it became unbearable. When William had died suddenly of a heart attack 2 months ago, Jacob felt the chains finally break. He'd spent the weeks since deciding whether to come forward, whether he could face the people he'd abandoned. "But you didn't abandon them," Porter said firmly. "You were taken, you were manipulated, you were a child." "I could have tried harder," Jacob insisted. "After the first few years, after I was old enough to understand, I could have found a way." Porter leaned forward. "Jacob, you were held captive by someone who'd constructed an entire false reality around you. That's not your fault. That's criminal kidnapping, probably a dozen other charges. You were a victim." But Jacob struggled to accept that framing. In his mind, he'd made choices, however constrained. He'd chosen to stay, to adapt, to become James Cross. He'd chosen not to risk exposure when he started working in Laramie and had opportunities to reveal his identity. The complexity of his captivity, neither locked in a basement nor free to leave, created a moral ambiguity he couldn't resolve. Stockholm Syndrome, the psychologists would later say, trauma bonding, learned helplessness. But to Jacob, it felt like culpability. Linda arrived in Laramie on August 17th, accompanied by Diane. The police arranged for them to meet at the hotel rather than the station, giving them privacy. Jacob waited in the room, pacing, rehearsing explanations that crumbled before he could speak them. When the knock came, he opened the door to see his mother, older, grayer but unmistakably her, standing in the hallway with tears already streaming down her face. She didn't say anything. She just pulled him into an embrace that he returned, stiff at first, then collapsing into it. 13 years of separation compressed into that single moment. They sat together for hours, Linda holding his hands while he told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her face cycling through emotions, relief, anger, grief, confusion. When he finished, she said, "I don't care what you think you should have done differently. You were a child and someone took you from me. That's not your fault. Do you understand?" Jacob nodded, though he didn't fully believe it. Linda continued, "And you're here now. You came back. That's what matters." But the reunion wasn't simple. The psychological damage ran deeper than either acknowledged in that initial meeting. Jacob struggled with guilt over the lost years, over the pain his disappearance had caused. Linda struggled with anger toward William Cross, toward the circumstances, toward a universe that could allow such a thing. She wanted to return to the relationship they'd had, mother and teenage son. But Jacob was a different person now. He'd lived an entire adult life in isolation, had developed survival mechanisms and perspectives that didn't align with the world Linda inhabited. The media descended on Laramie within days. The story of the missing North Carolina boy found alive after 13 years, living under a false identity in Wyoming, dominated national news. Reporters camped outside the police station and the hotel. Television crews requested interviews. True crime podcasters produced emergency episodes analyzing the case. The narrative that emerged in the press focused on the dramatic elements, the mysterious disappearance, the survivalist compound, the stolen identity, the miraculous return. But that narrative simplified the complex reality Jacob had lived. It turned 13 years of gradual psychological manipulation into a simple kidnapping story with a happy ending. Porter worked with Wyoming authorities to build a case against William Cross, though the man's death complicated prosecution. They identified other children who'd been at the Montana compound, reaching out to investigate whether Jacob's situation had been unique or part of a pattern. The FBI reopened their investigation into Cross's background, discovering he'd lost his son in 2007, as Jacob described, and had become increasingly delusional in the following years. Cross's family, his elderly parents in Ohio, expressed shock and grief when contacted, saying they'd lost touch with him in 2008 and hadn't known about the compound or about Jacob. Jacob's return raised uncomfortable questions about the original investigation. How had William Cross managed to watch the Hartley home for weeks without detection? Why had the search focused exclusively on the wilderness rather than considering abduction scenarios earlier? Porter defended the investigation while acknowledging its limitations: rural departments with limited resources, assumptions based on probability rather than possibility. The truth was that Jacob's case fell into a category law enforcement struggled with: stranger abduction by someone with no connection to the victim, motivated by psychological delusion rather than typical criminal objectives. The statistics said children disappeared into the woods more often than they vanished into elaborate false identities. The statistics had been wrong. Michael Hartley, Jacob's legal father, reconnected with him during this period. Their relationship was complicated. Michael had left the family but had participated in the search efforts and now appeared in Laramie, wanting to rebuild connection with the son he'd lost twice. Jacob met with him cautiously, still carrying abandonment wounds from childhood. Michael apologized for leaving, tried to explain his own struggles with depression and marriage failure. But Jacob struggled to reconcile the father he'd resented at 14 with the man standing before him now, adding another layer of psychological complexity to an already overwhelming situation. The legal questions surrounding Jacob's identity took months to resolve. He'd been living as James Cross for 13 years, had documentation under that name, had established employment history and credit. Converting back to Jacob Hartley required extensive paperwork, court proceedings, validation of his original birth certificate and social security number. He worked with lawyers pro bono to navigate the bureaucracy while simultaneously undergoing therapy to process his experiences. The therapist, Dr. Ellen Richardson, specialized in trauma and captivity cases. She helped Jacob understand that his survival mechanisms, the adaptation, the acceptance, the gradual adoption of his false identity, weren't moral failures but rational responses to impossible circumstances. Linda returned to North Carolina after 2 weeks, unable to stay away from work longer. Jacob promised to follow soon, but he struggled with the idea of returning to Pineville. The house on Timber Creek Road represented his childhood, but he wasn't that child anymore. The idea of sleeping in his old bedroom, surrounded by the life he'd lived at 13, felt suffocating. He'd spent 13 years as James Cross, and that identity, however false, had become real through repetition. Returning to Jacob Hartley meant excavating a self he barely remembered beneath the person he'd become. Porter stayed in Wyoming for a month, helping coordinate between multiple jurisdictions and agencies while building relationship with Jacob. They took long drives through the Wyoming landscape, talking about the case, about the years of searching, about what comes next. Porter felt both triumph and sadness. Triumph that he'd been right to never close the case, sadness at what Jacob had endured. He attended therapy sessions with Jacob when invited, providing perspective on the investigation and its limitations. He became something like a surrogate father figure, offering steady presence without the emotional complication of actual family. By October 2022, the media frenzy had largely subsided. The story had been told, analyzed, discussed. Public attention shifted to newer mysteries. Jacob remained in Laramie, uncomfortable with the idea of returning to North Carolina, but not ready to stay in Wyoming permanently either. He worked construction, lived in a small apartment, attended therapy twice weekly. Linda called every day, and they talked about mundane things: weather, her job, the garden she'd planted. Slowly, a new relationship formed between them, one built on their current selves rather than memories of who they'd been in 2009. The question everyone asked was what Jacob wanted to do now. Where would he live? What would he pursue? Would he press charges if there was anyone to charge? Would he write a book, sell his story, try to profit from his experience? Jacob had no clear answers. He felt suspended between identities, neither fully Jacob Hartley nor James Cross anymore. The trauma of his disappearance and captivity competed with the disorientation of return. Freedom, it turned out, carried its own weight. After 13 years of having his choices constrained, the infinite possibilities of an open future felt paralyzing rather than liberating. Dr. Richardson worked with him on what she called identity integration, finding a way to acknowledge both selves, to accept that James Cross had been a real experience even if based on a lie, and that Jacob Hartley could incorporate those years rather than trying to erase them. She helped him understand that recovery wouldn't mean returning to who he'd been at 14. That boy was gone. The challenge was deciding who he wanted to become now. In December 2022, on what would have been the 13th anniversary of his disappearance, Jacob traveled back to North Carolina. Linda met him at the Charlotte airport, and they drove together to Pineville. The town had changed less than he expected. Same pine forests, same winding roads, same sense of rural isolation. The house on Timber Creek Road looked smaller than his memories. Linda had finally changed his bedroom, converting it into a guest room, which Jacob appreciated. Sleeping in a shrine to his 14-year-old self would have been unbearable. He visited the woodpile where he'd last stood as Jacob Hartley. The shed had been replaced, the trees grown taller, but the basic geography remained the same. He tried to remember what he'd been thinking that morning, what had made him trust William Cross enough to follow him into the woods. The memory felt distant, like watching someone else's life through fog. He'd been lonely, he remembered that. Eager for connection, for family, for belonging, William had offered all of that, and Jacob had been desperate enough to believe him. Porter drove up from his retirement community in South Carolina to see Jacob during this visit. They met at a diner in Pineville, eating breakfast while catching up. Porter showed Jacob the case file he'd maintained for 13 years, hundreds of pages of reports, interviews, leads pursued and abandoned. "This consumed me," Porter admitted. "My wife used to say I cared more about finding you than being present with her. She wasn't entirely wrong. I let it become an obsession." Jacob felt the familiar guilt rise. "I'm sorry. I never meant for people to—" Porter cut him off. "No, don't do that. You don't get to apologize for being a victim. I chose to keep searching because I believed you deserved to be found. That was my choice, and I don't regret it." Over Christmas, Jacob met with extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, who'd been at his 14th birthday party that never happened. They treated him with careful kindness, asking gentle questions, avoiding the obvious topics, until Jacob brought them up himself. His cousin Beth, who'd been 11 when he disappeared and was now 24 with a baby of her own, told him, "We never stopped thinking about you. Every birthday, every holiday. You were always here, even when you weren't." Aye, the weight of all those missed years, all those people carrying his absence, pressed down on Jacob. He'd been so focused on his own survival that he hadn't fully processed the ripples of pain his disappearance had created. He stayed in North Carolina through January, reconnecting with the place and people of his childhood, while recognizing he couldn't simply resume the life that had been interrupted. Too much time had passed. He was a different person. Linda understood this better than anyone. One evening, sitting together in the living room, she said, "You don't have to stay here, you know. You don't owe me some kind of rewind button on the last 13 years. I just want you to be okay, wherever that is." Jacob felt something release in his chest, the unspoken expectation that return meant residence, that coming back meant staying. "I don't know where okay is yet," he admitted. "I'm still figuring it out." In February 2023, Jacob made a decision that surprised everyone. He enrolled in community college in Laramie. He wanted to study art, to reclaim that part of himself from before William Cross. He'd spent years drawing in private at the compound, using whatever materials he could find, creating entire sketchbooks that documented his internal life when he couldn't speak about it openly. Now he wanted to develop that skill formally, to see if the artistic child who disappeared at 14 still existed somewhere in the traumatized adult who'd emerged. Linda supported the decision, though it meant Jacob wouldn't return to North Carolina permanently. She flew to Wyoming to help him settle into student housing, and they spent a weekend setting up his space, buying art supplies, preparing for this new chapter. The story that emerged in the media disputed the official report's conclusions about exposure and death in the pine woods. But the deeper truth was more complicated than either narrative captured. Jacob hadn't died in the wilderness, but the 14-year-old who'd walked to that woodpile in 2009 had ceased to exist nonetheless. What returned 13 years later was someone new, shaped by captivity and survival, by adaptation and endurance, by loss and recovery. The question wasn't really about what had happened to Jacob Hartley, but about who he'd become in the years between disappearance and return, and who he might still become going forward. His art professor at community college, a woman named Janet Brooks, who knew nothing about his background when he enrolled, noticed something in his early sketches, a quality she described as haunted perspective. His drawings carried an intensity unusual for beginning students, as if he was drawing from memory rather than observation. When she asked him about it, Jacob simply said, "I had a lot of time alone to practice." She didn't push, respecting his privacy while nurturing his talent. Over the semester, his work evolved, becoming more complex, more willing to depict difficult emotions. He drew pine forests and Montana mountains, compound buildings and empty roads, faces of people who'd populated his captivity. The act of creating helped him process what words couldn't capture. Porter visited Laramie in April 2023, ostensibly to check on Jacob, but really to witness this new life-taking shape. He saw the art studio where Jacob spent hours sketching, met his professors and classmates, walked through the campus where this young man who'd been stolen at 14 was now building a future at 27. "You're going to be okay," Porter said one evening over dinner. Not a question, a statement. Jacob considered it. "Maybe. Some days feel impossible. Like I'm pretending to be a person who knows how to exist in the world. But then there are moments when I'm drawing or talking to someone or just walking across campus, and it feels almost normal, like I might actually figure this out." Porter nodded. That's what recovery looks like. Not perfect, just moments of almost normal that gradually get longer. The compound kids, the others who'd been raised in that Montana isolation, began reaching out to Jacob through social media and intermediaries as his story spread. Some shared similar experiences of psychological manipulation and enforced isolation. Others defended the community, insisting it had been a positive environment that Jacob was misrepresenting. The varied responses reflected the complexity of what they'd experienced. Some had been genuinely happy in that alternative lifestyle. Others had felt imprisoned by it. Jacob struggled with these contacts, wanting to connect with people who understood, but also wanting to move beyond being defined by that chapter. Dr. Richardson helped him establish boundaries, to accept that his experience was his own and didn't need to be reconciled with others' versions. By summer 2023, Jacob had established something resembling a life. He worked part-time at an art supply store, maintained decent grades in his classes, attended therapy regularly, called his mother several times a week. He'd even started dating tentatively, though explaining his background to potential partners proved challenging. How do you tell someone you're interested in that you legally didn't exist for 13 years? That you're still learning how to navigate normal social situations? That some days you wake up confused about who you are? Most relationships didn't survive those conversations, but he kept trying, kept practicing the vulnerability required for connection. Linda came to terms with her son's permanent relocation to Wyoming, recognizing that his healing required distance from the place his trauma had originated. She visited quarterly, staying in a hotel nearby and spending weekends with Jacob, attending his art shows, meeting his friends, observing the person he was becoming. She still maintained the blog she'd started during his disappearance, but now it documented his recovery rather than his absence. Other families with missing children reached out, seeking hope or guidance. Linda responded when she had energy, sharing what she'd learned about persistence and patience while acknowledging that most missing children's stories don't end with return. The question of what happened to Jacob Hartley ultimately had multiple answers, all true simultaneously. He'd been kidnapped by a delusional man seeking to replace a dead son. He'd been held captive through psychological manipulation rather than physical restraint. He'd survived by adapting to impossible circumstances in ways that looked like complicity, but were actually strategies for endurance. He'd returned by choice when the constraints that had held him finally released. And he'd spent the years since trying to integrate all these truths into a coherent self that could move forward rather than remaining trapped in the past. Porter eventually wrote a book about the case. Not the sensationalized true crime version publishers wanted, but a thoughtful examination of missing persons investigations, the limitations of search efforts, and the psychology of captivity. Jacob contributed to it, providing perspective from the missing person's side. The book sold modestly, but received praise from law enforcement and advocacy organizations for its nuanced approach. Proceeds went to non-profits supporting families of missing children and survivors of abduction. Michael Hartley remained a complicated presence in Jacob's life. They maintained contact but never achieved the closeness of before. Too much abandonment, too much loss. Jacob accepted that some relationships can't be fully repaired, only acknowledged and released. He found father figures elsewhere, in Porter, in Professor Brooks's husband who taught him woodworking, in the therapist he eventually switched to as his needs evolved. Family, he learned, could be constructed as well as inherited. The official report about Jacob Hartley's disappearance was formally amended in late 2023, correcting the presumed exposure death to reflect the reality of kidnapping and captivity. The amendment acknowledged investigative limitations while maintaining that the search had been thorough, given available information. Porter pushed for the changes, wanting the record to reflect truth rather than assumption. It mattered to him that future investigators reading the file would understand how complex these cases could be, how appearances could mislead. By 2024, Jacob had completed his first year of community college and was considering transfer to a 4-year university for a degree in fine arts. His work had improved dramatically, earning recognition in regional student exhibitions. He'd begun a series of pieces about identity and memory, exploring themes of loss and recovery through mixed media. Critics who knew his background read the trauma into every brushstroke, but Jacob insisted the work had to stand independently. "I don't want to be the artist who disappeared for 13 years," he said. "I want to be an artist whose work happens to be informed by that experience, among others." Linda retired from her school secretary position in March 2024, 58 years old and ready for a different pace of life. She stayed in the house on Timber Creek Road but traveled more, visiting Jacob in Wyoming regularly and taking trips to places she'd always wanted to see. The years of waiting, of grief, of uncertainty had aged her, but the resolution, however imperfect, had also freed her. She could finally mourn the childhood Jacob had lost while celebrating the adult he'd become. She could acknowledge the pain while also experiencing joy. Recovery, she learned, didn't mean forgetting or erasing, just making room for other emotions alongside the grief. Jacob's story continued to circulate in true crime communities and missing persons advocacy circles, always framed as a miracle or mystery. But to Jacob, living it day by day, it felt less miraculous than simply ongoing. He got up each morning, attended classes or went to work, created art, maintained relationships, attended therapy. He experienced setbacks, panic attacks triggered by pine forests, dissociative episodes when stressed, nightmares about the compound. But he also experienced progress, moments of genuine happiness, relationships that deepened, achievements that felt earned rather than obligatory. The work of recovery proved longer and harder than the dramatic return, but also more meaningful. Porter's health declined in late 2024, heart problems that required surgery and lengthy recovery. Jacob visited him in South Carolina, spending 2 weeks helping around the house and keeping the retired detective company. They talked about the case from both perspectives, filling in gaps, answering questions neither had been able to ask before. Porter admitted he'd sometimes wondered if Jacob had run away voluntarily, if the wilderness exposure theory was wrong, but so was kidnapping. Jacob admitted he'd known Porter's name years before returning, had read articles about the detective who wouldn't give up, and that knowledge had made coming forward feel both necessary and terrifying. They acknowledged the strangeness of their connection, victim and investigator, neither role quite fitting the relationship they'd developed. The compound in Montana, abandoned since 2019, burned down in a wildfire during summer 2024. When Jacob heard the news, he felt unexpected grief. That place had been his home for 10 years. However twisted the circumstances, the destruction of the physical space felt like losing a part of his history, even the parts he wanted to forget. Dr. Richardson helped him process this complicated mourning, recognizing that trauma sites can hold both pain and memory, and losing them erases evidence of survival. Jacob eventually traveled to Montana, stood on the blackened ground where buildings had stood, and sketched the ruins. The drawing became part of his art series, a way to acknowledge without being consumed. Years passed. Jacob graduated with his associate degree, transferred to University of Wyoming, worked toward his bachelor's in fine arts. He had relationships that lasted more than a few months, learned to explain his background without it becoming his entire identity. He maintained close connection with Linda, saw Porter regularly until the detective's death in 2026, attended therapy less frequently as he developed his own coping mechanisms. He created art that explored themes beyond his captivity, landscapes, portraits, abstract explorations of color and form. He became gradually someone whose defining feature wasn't what had happened to him, but what he'd made of himself afterward. The disappearance of Jacob Hartley and his return 13 years later remained one of those cases that defied easy explanation. It was categorized as a miracle, a mystery, an example of survivorship. But to those who lived it most intimately, Jacob, Linda, Porter, it was simply life in its most complicated form. Loss and recovery, grief and hope, trauma and resilience existing simultaneously without neat resolution. Jacob's story disputed the official report's conclusion about his death, but more importantly, it disputed the assumption that recovery meant returning to who you were before. Sometimes, he learned, the only way forward is accepting that you're someone entirely new. In 2027, Jacob opened his first solo art exhibition in a Laramie gallery. The collection explored themes of identity, memory, and transformation through paintings, sketches, and mixed media pieces. Linda attended the opening, proud and tearful, watching her son discuss his work with critics and collectors. She overheard someone ask Jacob about the trauma evident in his pieces, and his response, "I'm not trying to depict trauma. I'm trying to depict what comes after." The living that happens in spite of and because of what was lost. It was, she thought, the most articulate answer to the question everyone had been asking since his return. Not what happened in those 13 years, but what he'd chosen to do with them since. The story of the boy who disappeared in the pine woods and returned 13 years later continued to circulate, retold and analyzed and mythologized. But the real story was quieter and longer. It was Jacob learning to sleep without nightmares, maintaining friendships that lasted years, creating art that mattered to him, building a life that felt authentic rather than constructed. It was Linda learning to be mother to an adult she hadn't raised through adolescence, accepting distance while maintaining connection. It was Porter's determination to correct the record, to ensure the truth was documented, even if it arrived 13 years late. It was Dr. Richardson's patient work, helping integrate fragmented identity into coherent self. It was all the small moments of recovery that never made headlines, but constituted the actual work of surviving and then learning to do more than just survive. Jacob's story disputed the official report in its conclusion, but more profoundly, it disputed the narrative arc people wanted to impose on it. There was no dramatic rescue, no clear villain to punish, no simple return to normalcy. Just the complicated reality of a child taken, years lost, and the slow, difficult work of becoming someone who could exist in both truths simultaneously, who he'd been, who he'd become, who he might still be. The pine woods where he disappeared remained, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded at their edge. The house on Timber Creek Road still stood, now just a house rather than a shrine. And Jacob lived in Wyoming, creating art, and attending classes and calling his mother and doing all the ordinary things that constitute a life, rebuilt from pieces of two fractured identities. 13 years after his disappearance, what showed up wasn't just Jacob Hartley. It was Jacob and James, integrated and inseparable, carrying both stories forward into whatever came next. The official report had been wrong about his death. But more importantly, the assumptions about what return would mean had been wrong too. Recovery wasn't resurrection, it was construction. And that work, Jacob learned, lasted far longer than captivity, but offered something captivity never could. The freedom to become someone new while honoring who you'd been. That was the story that emerged from the pine woods, 13 years delayed but finally, partially told.